All right. Welcome back, everybody. And today we are going to be going back and taking a look at two of Vero's most recent releases, the Gen 2 Synapse and the Synapse XL. So I have needed to do a in-depth review of these after I've had a few weeks with each of them in my pocket. And because most of my thoughts are actually mirror images from the one knife to the other, I thought that I would combine these into one video so that we could just take care of all of it at the same time. So the Synapse XL has spent a considerable amount more time in my pocket. I have used it for a ton of different things. I've also used the Gen 2 Synapse for a ton of different things. I have done everything from open boxes to cut food to do daily tasks with my inspection business, checking floor joists, cutting tape from, cutting paint from attic scuttles, trying to get into attics and crawl spaces, doing things, that your typical person might do with a knife. I've used it to trim tree branches when I couldn't find my my cutters. So I'm getting ready to plant some cherry trees, and they needed some minor pruning. And we're just talking about tiny little saplings here. It's not trees. So just a broad assortment of general actions. And I wanted to go into what I thought after using these knives. So let's start off with the pros. So with these knives, the flipper tab on the back is nice and small. So this tiny little flipper tab does not get in the way in the pocket in any way, shape, or form, is easy to access with the finger, and I have absolutely no complaints about the size or the use of that flipper tab. I think it's a very good design. It's a breath of fresh air. And Joseph has been actually doing a very, very good job at kind of reinventing some things that we think about in the knife market. So the clip or the flipper tab on both of these knives is very, very similar, just scaled up a little bit for the Synapse XL, but overall roughly the same design language in both of those. So flipper tab is great. The size of both of these knives is also phenomenal. So those of you that have watched multiple videos of mine, you will know that I like knives that are 3.5 inch in cutting edge and larger. So you would think that my favorite out of the two would be the XL, which fits in that category. It's a decently sized knife. Most would consider this a large knife, but the blade on this is a very good size, and surprisingly for the size of the knife, this feels really, really crisp when opening and using this knife. So he's managed to design a large knife that still feels a little bit agile, a little bit quick, and it is fun to fidget with. This thing is a fidget dream. But my favorite is actually the Gen 2 Synapse. This is a gorgeous, gorgeous knife, and it takes all of the things out of the Synapse XL. And to put this into perspective, the Synapse XL was the first Synapse that I had. I was not privileged enough to be one of the people that found Vero at an early enough stage to pick up a Gen 1, which is funny because sitting on my desk in hopes that I would at some point in time get a Gen 1, I've got a set of Gen 1 scales that I have never put on anything because I don't own a Gen 1. So, that just kind of funny thing. Kind of dummy me bought a set of scales thinking, I'll get a knife eventually, and no knife. So those will probably go up on the Facebook group here relatively soon. So the Gen 2 Synapse was actually an afterthought for me. So this was the knife that I received after experiencing the XL. So I bought this just because I pretty much buy everything that Joseph puts out because I think he's a great maker. I love supporting people that that I like in the industry. And I think that he's doing a lot of really, really good things to the knife community and to kind of set the bar at a certain level for a lot of knife makers. You know, when it comes to communication and his involvement, he's doing a lot better than the majority of people, I think, that are in his same position. Anyways, back to the knife. So I purchased the Gen 2 Synapse with the anticipation that I would probably think that it was a great knife, but also probably that it would be too small for me and I wouldn't want to keep it. And during my early use of this knife, I was actually pleasantly surprised that the size did not bother me. The size of this knife, the action of this knife is beautiful. Again, Joseph has done a fantastic job at making a gorgeous expression of a knife. Everything on here is really, really attractive to the eye. So size on both of them, really, really good. Action and fidget ability. So I already talked about the flipper tab on the back. Flipper tab works very, very well opening and shutting the knife. But one area where Joseph has kind of changed the industry a little bit is the V-spot, or I believe that's what the Facebook group calls it, the V-spot, or the little fuller that you have here somewhat, where your finger fits in and you get to flick the knife. I just happen to have another knife here that I was carrying today, which will be, I'm kind of doing the research for the remainder of the review on the CKF Evo. This would be the Evo 2. It kind of has this little hole here. This hole, Spidey flick hole, is actually just large enough for me to get just the meat of the tip of my finger in, and it's actually quite comfortable. But most knives don't have that same level of comfort in them. They don't have a good chamfer around the edge. They've got sharp edges. They're uncomfortable to fidget with for long periods of time, and Joseph fixed that with his kind of standalone design with this somewhat elongated rectangle shape that does not penetrate all the way through the blade. So this just goes about probably about halfway through the blade and just ends. Again, many of you probably watch a lot of knife reviews, and that's the reason why you've come here to take a look at this. So you've probably seen Nick Shabazz's video where he talks about the fulcrum. Now, Nick Shabazz is a guy. He's an interesting guy. I've kind of lost a little bit of interest in his videos as of late, but he talked about some of the more like nitpicky things about a knife. So he mentioned in this V-spot, because it wasn't protruding all the way through, it wasn't a full protrusion, that a lot of gook and gunk and dirt would get caught in that. I would say that I have a lot dirtier day job than old Nicky over there does, and I have not had an issue with large amounts of gunk sitting in either one of these knives. This Synapse Gen 2 was in my pocket yesterday, where I crawled in 2 crawl spaces and 3 attics. So I'm around fiberglass insulation, cellulose insulation, vermiculite. I'm in the dust, dirt, grime, cobwebs of a crawl space, and this knife is perfectly clean. So not a big deal. But the fidgetability, the fun of using your finger in that V-spot and just kind of playing with the knife. You have the multiple ways of opening it, and the detent is actually loose enough that if you wanted to play around with just some moving here, flicking it open, that works great as well. So action, fidget factor, all there. So let's switch over to the XL to talk about blade geometry. So the blade of these Synapses are both pretty much the exact same shape. You have a nice drop point. You have this swedge across the back, which is coming to a taper all the way down to the tip, which makes the tip of this knife very, very stabby. Anything that you're wanting to cut with this, the tip of this knife has good durability, has a nice thin profile. So if you're wanting to stab into something, like I mentioned, I've used this to cut leather. It's not something that I need to do. I have specialized leather knives, but for the sake of reviewing, I wanted to give, kind of a test. And I had absolutely no issues cutting leather, cutting all the way through, scoring leather, and I even skived a little bit of leather. And for those of you that don't do leather working, skiving is where you make a horizontal cut kind of parallel to the table. And instead of cutting all the way through the leather, you kind of cut just a layer off of it and thin it for like folding over edges, doing piping, things like that. And this knife actually did very, very well at those tasks. The M390 of the blade steel is very, very sharp, straight out of the box. Best Tech seemed to have done a pretty good job on the sharpening. I did touch up both of these knives on my Wicked Edge just a tiny, tiny bit because there were a couple of areas where the edge geometry wasn't absolutely perfect. A couple areas that had a little bit of an issue with just a tiny bit of an apex. So the apex wasn't quite there. There was a little bit of burr left. So I touched that up. But other than that, these both cut paper right out of the package. So if you're doing the paper test, they both nailed it with flying colors. So blade shape, blade geometry, both great. Cutting, fantastic. Ergonomics is kind of the last pro that we're going to go into. Ergonomics, just like I mentioned in size, these knives fit very well in the hand. So if you're holding it like this, or like this, or like this, all of those are very good. And if you're keeping the bulk of your hand on the scale and your thumb kind of choked back here on the knife, this is a very, very, very comfortable knife. Leads me right into some of the cons. So the jimping on this knife actually does not go any further than the bolster. So the jimping ends right there, right at the end of the handle of the knife. And you can see even on the XL here, if I'm holding this knife, there's my thumb on the jimping. I'm going to get a hell of a cramp. I'm going to get a hell of a cramp right here, keeping my thumb on the jimping in this manner. Now I could roll my thumb up or something like that. I would have really liked to have seen that jimping come a little bit further up on the blade. So if I'm choking up on the blade, something like that, I think that jimping could have gone just a little bit further up there. And that is the same for the Gen 2 Synapse. So that jimping is pretty far back. If you're choking up on the knife at all, this is all just smooth, and your thumb really doesn't have any texture there to hold on to. Next con is the micarta. So I think that micarta is a little bit opinion-based because everybody has a different feeling when it comes to the micarta of a knife. Some people like it to be a little bit unfinished, a little bit textured, a little bit fluffy, furry, whatever you want to call it. And some people like it to be a little bit more refined, perfect edges. And that would be the camp that I fall into. I really like a lot of the custom knives, a lot of the Riot knives where you have the micarta, you look at all of the edges, you don't see any tufts or little furry areas where that micarta is sticking out, looks a little bit unfinished. But I've also witnessed a lot of people in the Facebook group that say they absolutely love that. It gives a little bit of texture to hold on to. They kind of like the aged look of it. Looks like the micarta has a little bit of wear on it. And I'm not sure what it is that Best Tech is doing to these, whether it's a bead blast on the micarta to give it a texture that's leaving these tufted edges. If they're maybe not getting a very good bond or a perfect bond, maybe they're not pressurizing the micarta to get that epoxy into all of those areas. But I have noticed on both of these synapses that there are areas where you get those little tufts and furry areas. There's also a few spots where between the frame and the micarta, there are little gaps or voids, which makes me think almost that, either the scale maybe had a variance in the milling, maybe the scale shrunk as it's sit in my pocket, which is kind of what I believe here on the Synapse Gen 2, because I did not find any of those voids on the Synapse Gen 2, but after 2 weeks in my pocket, when I pulled it out for this review after carrying it for day after day after day, I noticed some of those areas. So maybe there's parts of the micarta that maybe shrink just a little bit, and that's leaving those voids between the frame and the micarta, but it's kind of a little pet peeve to me that just bothers me a tiny bit. Not a major deal, not impacting the use of the knife in any way, shape, or form, more cosmetic than anything, more nitpicky. We talked about the jimping. Now let's hit on the big one for me. And I know I've mentioned this in every single Joseph video or Vero video, but I've kind of gotten to a little bit of a tipping point with this issue, and that is the clip. So the clip on these two knives is probably the biggest problem that I have with Vero designs. And I know that it's not just me that has it, it's the entire well, not the entire, but it's a large group of people that have issues with the clip. But my issue with the clip, I don't think is the same as most everyone else's. So the common clip complaint that I see is people complaining about a hot spot or a sore spot that the clip develops in the hand. I do not have that. So when I hold the Synapse XL, you can see how that clip is situated in my hand. The tip or the ramp on this clip actually lands between these two pads of my hand. Actually helps me grip the handle of the knife a little bit better. And because it fits right in between the middle and ring finger, it does not develop a hot spot for me. That is not the issue at all. I don't think that these clips are uncomfortable, and it could be because of my hand size. You know, it might just be that I'm right in that perfect area where it's hitting the perfect spot, and I don't have that issue. Same with the Gen 2 Synapse. Absolutely no issues. It sits in a great spot in my hand. No problems with that. My problem is with the way that the ramp sticks out. I have caught the paint on my truck. Getting in and out of my truck, I've scratched the paint next to my door, next to the tailgate of my truck. Walking around the corner of my truck, I can see scratch marks, you know, and that's partly my fault for, you know, getting too close to the doorway of my truck or walking too close to the edge of my truck. That's partly my issue. But these are the only knives that I notice that problem with. Another problem, getting in and out of my truck, I end up snagging the ramp on this clip on everything. It is my biggest complaint when it comes to these knives, and the reason why I'm at the tipping point on these. So it's been a little while since I've had the Synapse XL in my pocket, but when I was carrying it almost daily for the couple of weeks that I was doing that, I reached into my pocket twice only to find that the knife wasn't there. So, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am an inspector. So I carry a tool bag, I carry a tool pouch, I'm carrying ladders in and out of houses, I'm carrying various tools, things with straps on them. There are a lot of things that'll be slung over my shoulder, slung over my back, being carried in my hand and kind of in that pocket area. So often, and even the fleece vest that I'm wearing right now has a little rubber tension cord right at the waistline. I'll find a lot of times I'll stand up from sitting down at a diner and I'll notice that my right side feels a little bit tighter than it should. And I reach down and that little rubber piece is hung up on the ramp of my Vero knife. Now, that's a little bit agitating, you know, to constantly have to be checking your pocket and then go, okay, is it in the seat of my truck? Did it snag on the seat belt when I came out? Is it on the sidewalk that I was walking up to the house with the ladder slung over my shoulder? Is it somewhere in this 5,500 square foot home that I now have to retrace my steps for? Is it up in the attic? And maybe when I was getting out of the scuttle or the attic access hatch, maybe my pocket clip caught on the edge of the attic, and then as my body slid out, the knife stayed right there. There are a lot of questions that go through your mind when that happens. Like I said, twice with the Synapse XL, 3 or 4 times with the Gen 2 Synapse. The last one happened, I believe, yesterday. It was either yesterday or the day before. I had just finished inspecting 2 homes. Hadn't had to pull my knife out in a while. I was waiting for a client to arrive, and I was going to pull out my knife and fidget with it. You know, flick it around, annoy somebody with the noise, and my pocket was empty. Mind you, I've spent the last 6 hours in 2 different homes, both of them very, very large, both of them very intricate, and both of them occupied. So it's a little bit difficult that I'm going to have to look through the house that I'm currently at. If it's not there, call the owners of the previous house and say, hey, I need to come back. I know you've got children. My knife might be somewhere in your house. I have no idea where. That's not a fantastic thing to happen. It's also not a fantastic thing to think about your nearly $450, $400 knife being lost somewhere. So I pulled out my ladder out of my truck. First place I wanted to look was the attic, because the attic is typically the last place that I come out of when I do my inspections. And the first thing I thought of, I'm like, okay, it's probably hung up on the scuttle. So I go up in the attic. I'm pulling out all of the insulation, pulling it back, sifting through it. I walk clear through the attic. I'm looking for any like drop marks. This is also blown in insulation. So if it did drop somewhere in the attic, it would have been gone probably forever. I would have never found it. Got back out of the attic, scoured the entire house, couldn't find it. Probably spent like 30, 45 minutes going through this house like a maniac trying to find this knife that I had lost somewhere. Then I got on the phone to call the sellers of the first home that I was at, and I just happened to be standing in a bedroom. There was a big area rug, a white and black area rug, sitting in that room. I'm dialing the phone, it's ringing. I look down, and this is sitting on like a black zebra stripe on the carpet, and I could see where there was some insulation on it and a couple of ding marks in the floor. So when I came out of the attic and I was walking or kind of climbing down my ladder, it must have snagged on the edge of the attic scuttle, fell on a bunch of the occupant's stuff that was in the bottom of the closet, bounced a couple of times on that rug, and then found a black spot on the rug that was perfectly colored, almost the same as the knife. And if it wasn't for the knife being partially opened and seeing that shiny edge on the knife, I may still not have seen it. But that was a lot of time wasted, a lot of worry, thinking, okay, where is my knife? Both of these homes had children in them, so if I wouldn't have found it, I would have had to worry about those children possibly finding the knife, possibly cutting themselves, and then who's getting the call about that? So I have done a lot of different things trying to figure out ways, outside of carrying it in a different fashion, which is not really something that I want to do, because the things have fit in my pockets in the exact same way for 2 decades. The knife goes in the same spot, my phone, my wallet, my hank, my pry bar, everything goes in the exact same spot. I'm not changing that. So I have come to the conclusion that at this point in time, the clip is a deal breaker for me. So I think that I'm a minority in that. I think because of the trade that I work in, that's probably just going to be the issue that I have. It may not be the same issue that other people have, but it's my biggest complaint. Lastly, and I don't think that I went over this, the other issue that I found in both of these knives is that the blade on the back is just a little bit too close or too accessible from the spine of the knife. So when the knife blade is closed, and I've actually noticed this on a couple pairs of my jeans, the knife blade, there's a little cutout on the back of the spine right in this section that will actually allow you to get the meat of your finger down in there if you try. And rubbing my finger back and forth, of course, I can impact the blade right there, and I can get some cuts on the callus on the end of my finger. I've never cut myself with this section, but there's a little fold right behind the pocket of my jeans that has been cut. So I did my laundry not too long ago, was folding my laundry, and I looked at the area of my pocket, and I happened to see this absolutely perfect slice right in that section. And this had been the only knife that I had carried because that was a relatively new pair of jeans. So there was just enough access to that sharp edge, or that corner of the blade right here on the spine, to get access to my jeans and to cut them. Again, not a huge deal. These work jeans get torn and cut and ripped and everything else. That's why I buy them in such regular intervals. But again, a little bit of an issue, a little bit of a problem. So that has been, oh my gosh, it is 25 minutes going through the final thoughts on these Vero knives. So thank you, anybody that has tuned in this long. If you have any additional comments, please put them in the comment box below. I really appreciate you taking the time to view this entire video. Excuse me. I would like to end this video with just one little snippet. So I've talked about the pros and I have talked about the cons of these knives. Taken out of context, it can seem like these cons are a little bit nitpicky, or that I maybe think negatively of Vero the company, Vero the designer. That is not the case in any way, shape, or form. I think that Joseph is doing a phenomenal job with the manufacture of these knives. He's constantly trying to increase production. People want these knives so bad. And because of the few issues that I have with mine, I'm actually going to be putting these on the market. So maybe I can possibly get these into the hand of somebody that hasn't had them before. But I think that he's doing things that are unique to him. I think that he's doing things that can better the knife industry. I think that he's, like I said before, setting the bar for other makers up there. So they need to be getting better at customer service and contact, and being involved in the community, and really taking an understanding or a liking as to what their customers are wanting. And I think that Joseph's on a tremendous trajectory to really do a lot of good in the knife community, to really build a great business and really change a lot of things. My only other complaint, so these two knives are keepers in every aspect except for the clip. I know that recently Joseph has been talking about making an upgrade for these clips, kind of flattening out this ramp, which I think will solve the problem of people talking about the hot spots in hand. But for me personally, I don't think that flat area is going to make a big difference on it hanging up on my tool belts, on my equipment, on the things that it is. So I kind of wish that there would be some kind of like secondary market for aftermarket clips, somebody like Lynch out there making a wire clip for these, or, just like a stamped clip or something like that, just for an option for someone like myself out there that has these kind of issues with the knife. I think if that were available, these would both be permanent fixtures in my collection, and it's unfortunate that we're not at that place yet, but these are still on the buy list for me. So thank you all for joining in. Hope you have a good day.